We are now going to talk about the section 6A and section 6B. Please note capital letters. Medical rebates which are available to natural persons only. Now if I take you back to our tax framework, over here we calculate our taxable income. We then calculate our tax by our tax tables. We deduct all our section 6 rebates, primary, secondary, tertiary, 6 squat potentially. You will add then all of your other taxes which are payable. Now pay attention here, make sure you see. This is in things like tax on your lump sums and additional taxes that you need to pay under section 12T. Section 12 capital T is a tax-free investment section. Remember there are limits there. They say you can only contribute X amount. If you contribute more than that, 40% of that is taxable, or a percentage of that is taxable. Refer to those rules there, all of those other taxes. Then you deduct your section 6A and section 6B medical rebates. Important, guys, it must be after your tax on your lump sums. So I'm going to say must be after retirement and plus withdrawal benefits. This is obviously a section you study on your own, so if you've not yet done it, it will be clear once you've done that. But please understand where you put it. It's after your other taxes. So it goes tax per tables, section 6 rebates, other taxes, section 6A and section 6B. If you mess this up, guys, you'll get negative marks. So, how does this work? Very, very simple. Again, also just on this slide, showing you it is not a deduction against your taxable income. So it's not placed here. It's placed after your rebates. Now this little simplified here, I don't show you the full tax framework. It's after your rebates, obviously as well. See, here's your rebate, so it's after it. But just remember that these other taxes will be in between, if it is applicable. Okay, so how does it work? So section 6A, this is the first one. This is the medical scheme fees tax credit. All taxpayers qualify for this if they belong to medical aids and payment has been made to a medical aid. Right, so in a little bit more detail, it's either the taxpayer or the dependent needs to be a medical aid. So it is possible, for example, that you are not on the medical aid, but one of your dependents are on a medical aid and you are paying for them. Then you can still get it. But someone needs to belong to a medical aid. You are a dependent. And there must be payment made to that medical aid. And this happens either you make it or your employer does it. If your employer pays your medical aid contributions, you'll be taxed on that as a fringe benefit, which is something you'll study separately, and then you will still qualify for this credit. Right. How do we know what the amount of the section 6A is? Now the first thing I want you to understand is that this is updated all the time, so you need to refer to your Psycho Student Handbook. On the student platform there's also a document I've uploaded called tax rates and tax tables that you can refer to. You will also be provided in the exam with this, with the correct rates. How you know what is the amount? So first of all, you'll have to look in your Psycho Student Handbook, and then you need to understand that it works on the following principle. It depends on the amount of dependents. So, guys, make sure you hear carefully what I'm saying here. This is not the correct amounts. This is just a simple example of the principle of how this works. You must refer to your Psycho Student Handbook and all the tax tables that will be provided to you in the exams and tests for whatever rates to use. Okay. So, I'm saying to you, assume, make sure you see, just for the purpose of this example, that the Tax Act says Section 6A is 300 rands per month for the taxpayer and an additional 300 rands a month for one dependent. And it is 200 rands then for each additional dependent. This taxpayer makes a contribution for himself and 3 dependents. So there are 4 people belonging to the medical aid, as you can see. So how it works, and this is honestly, guys, just my amounts here are different from the Act, but the principle is the same. How it works is you say the taxpayer gets 300 rands a month. then one of the dependents, so the first dependent, remember there are 4 people, taxpayer and 3 dependents, so one of these dependents also we get 300 rands for one. And then for every additional one, you get 200 rands. So the idea here, originally when it was envisioned, is to give it for example, father, mother, and their children, so then qualify for the others. Now, it doesn't mean there has to be a father and a mother. If there's a mother and 3 children, she'll still qualify for the same. It doesn't say 300 rands for the taxpayer and spouse. It says taxpayer and the one dependent. Right, so you get that per month. Now, in this case, I say assume that the taxpayer paid for 8 months. So you'll have to see in the question, you'll then multiply that by 8. That will give you your section 6A. You'll also see that. So guys, please just make sure, what I'm trying to say here is to make sure and go and look at your Cycle Student Handbook for the correct rates. But this is the principle. Principle is important. Don't have to memorize the rates. Right, so just a couple of extra information here. You can still get this section 6A rebate if your deceased estate paid for the medical aid. So for example, you pass away and your estate is still paying it for a couple of months for your dependents. When they calculate your taxes, they'll still view it as if you paid it. Or if your employer pays it. So if your employer pays it, so imagine you're working for someone, your employer, your boss, the company you work for, pays your medical aid. You will then be taxed on that as a fringe benefit, but then you can get this deduction or this credit. And then I just want to make sure you see what is a dependent for section 6A. So remember we keep talking here, we say if it's you and your dependents. Right, what is a dependent? A dependent is either your spouse or husband or wife, child, other members of your family, or any other person which your medical aid has allowed as a dependent. They won't just allow every single person, so whoever they've allowed. So that's section 6A, guys, very simple. Then we look at section 6B. Now section 6B is also very simple. Both of these sections are very simple. All that you need to do as a student is you need to make sure that you spend enough time learning the formulas that we're going to be looking at section 6B. You also will find it in the Act, but just study the formulas as I give them here. It's easy to do. So section 6B. So let's first talk about section 6A. Just the important point. Section 6A you get if you belong to a medical aid, or you or your dependents, and the medical aid was paid. So there must be a medical aid. If you don't belong to this medical aid, you don't get section 6A. Section 6B is available to every single person who has a qualifying medical expense that's been incurred, as well as and/or contributions to the medical aid. So, if you are a person who is contributing to medical aid, you get section 6A, and you can consider section 6B for your medical aid and other expenses. If you do not contribute to a medical aid, you can get section 6B still. So that's important for you to understand. It's available for everyone. So, these qualifying medical expenses that I mentioned here, what are the qualifying medical expenses? Right, you can find it also in section 6B, but it's simple, guys. The idea behind it is that it must be a medical person who has been registered. So it's a medical practitioner like a doctor, surgeon, a dentist, optometrist, homeopath, physiotherapist, etc. It's also for nursing homes, hospitals, nurses, midwives, nursing assistants, and if you go to a pharmacy and you get prescription medicine. So not just medicine over the counter, headache tablets, prescription medicine, so prescribed by a doctor. So you can get it if you pay any of these amounts, you can still get a deduction for it, or this credit for it. I want you to understand here, guys, it must be someone that's registered, so a proper medical professional. You can't just go to your neighbor and pay them to give you their home cooked remedy. You can't go to traditional healers, informal traditional healers who are not registered doctors, right, or registered medical practitioners. It must be proper licensed persons. You can then qualify for it. If your medical aid, so if you belong to medical aid, what happens sometimes is you'll pay for these amounts and your medical aid will reimburse you. If your medical aid reimburses you, you can't claim a deduction for it as well. Because then, if you think about it, if you spend 10,000 rands and your medical aid, so that's a cash outflow, gave you 10,000 rands, then what was the amount out of pocket? Nothing. You can't claim for anything. If you paid 10,000 rands and your medical aid reimbursed you 6,000 rands, it means you 4,000 rands out of pocket. You can claim on that 4,000. So basically, the amount that you are out of pocket, you can claim. Now, how does it work, guys? They distinguish between 3 types of taxpayers for Section 6B. They talk about taxpayers who are 65 years or older, taxpayers where there's a disability, and then all other taxpayers. So these will be people younger than 65 and no disability. All right. Now, the nice thing about it is that there are 2 formulas. The taxpayers who are 65 or older and the taxpayers with disabilities gets calculated in the same way. It's just this one which is different. Right, so guys, this is how it works. You should memorize this. Practice it. This counts a lot of marks in exams. So if a taxpayer is 65 or older, or there's someone with a disability. So let's first just talk here. You can get this qualification or this technical formula if you are 65 or older, or the taxpayer's spouse, or their child has a disability, or a child has a disability. So important here, if your grandmother is one of your dependents, it is possible for her to be one of your dependents, remember, because we saw in the Section 6A, they said that a dependent is someone who is on your medical aid. So if your medical aid accepted your grandmother as a dependent, and she has a disability, then you will not get this because it's not the taxpayer's spouse, or the child. So only those people. If any one of those has a disability, you get this. So if I'm a taxpayer and I do not have a disability, but my child has a disability and I'm paid the medical aid for my child, I still get this quality deduction. Right. So how does it work? It works as follows. It says, take your medical aid contributions, if you have any. From that amount, you deduct 3 times whatever your Section 6A credit was. So whatever you calculated. Right. If there's any amount left, so it can't be negative. If there's any amount left, so if this was 5,000 and this was 2,000, let's say, then you're left with 3,000. You take that 3,000 and you multiply it by exactly 33.3%. Not 33.3333, not a third, because that is 33.333, exactly 33.3%. Right, that gets you that amount over there. That's the first part of your calculation. You then take all of your other qualifying medical expenses. So those qualifying medical expenses were these ones we spoke of here, which you pay to a doctor, the pharmacy, etc. And you get 33.3% of that as well. You add those 2 up, and that gives you the total Section 6B amount. Right. For all other taxpayers, this one is a little bit more complicated. You say medical aid contributions less 4 times Section 6A. Make sure you see 4 times. Here it was 3 times. It's 4 times Section 6A. That leaves you for an amount. Can't be a negative amount. So if it is 10,000 rands and you calculate this to be 12,000 rands, you just make this null over here. Right. You can't make a negative amount. Right. That amount then, plus your medical expenses, these qualifying medical expenses, and as again, it's the same qualifying medical expenses that we saw over here, which is these ones over here. You add that up, that gives you another subtotal over there. From that, you deduct then 7.5% of whatever your taxable income was. And if there's anything left here, again, it can't be a negative amount. 25% of is your Section 6B. So make sure you see, over here, when the taxpayer is 65 or older, or there's a disability, we take the first bit, which is the medical aid contribution section. I'm going to just do a block here like this. We take that first bit, and you get 33%. Then we do the next bit, the qualifying medical expenses, and you get 33%. But when the taxpayer is younger than 65 and there's no disability, you do all of these things and only then calculate the 25%. So it's a lot more difficult to qualify for this deduction over here. You have to have a low taxable income and high qualified medical expenses most of the time to qualify for something over here. Right, so I'm going to just do a very simple example here. Just of this more complicated one quickly. Let's say Mr. X has taxable income of 700,000. I'm going to say here, assume, make sure you see, assume tax per tables equals 300,000. So guys, this is all just assumption. Belongs to a medical aid. I'm showing the principle. These amounts are not correct. The principle. You need to use the correct amounts depending on your Psycho Student Handbook and how the act has changed. It belongs to the medical aid and pays 2,000 rands per month. Mr. X has 2 dependents. Okay, so let's actually just add one extra thing. Other qualifying medical expenses equals, I'm going to make it high, 100,000 rands, just so that we can get something in. Right, then I'm going to say here another assume section 6A, taxpayer plus 1 dependent equals 300 rands each. Additional dependents equals 200 rands each. Okay, so again guys, all of these are assumptions and not the correct amounts. Don't contact me and say, this is not what my act says, definitely not what your act says. Right, so I'm just going to write it down. So we say taxable income, you would have now calculated that, is given to us here as being 700,000 rands. Right, so we're sitting here, taxable income. Then we say tax per tables. You go to the relevant tax tables, guys, and you get the tax and you calculate the tax per the tax tables. Whatever that is, in my case, we just assume it as that. Right, so let's clean up here a little bit. So we've now done this, tax per tables. Now it's your section 6 rebates. So section 6 rebates, right, whatever that amount is. Then it's section 6A. Now this taxpayer has 2 dependents. So we get, in my example, just in my example, 300 rands for the taxpayer, 300 rands for the 1 dependent, and 200 rands for the next dependent. Times 12 for the entire year. Okay, so guys, focus on the principle here, the principle. Section 6B then. Now you just basically copy down this formula here and you just fill it in. So that's why I'm saying you should need to study it all by heart. So you say medical aid contributions. How much did you contribute to the medical aid? This taxpayer contributed 2,000 rands a month, we said. So 24,000 rands. You then say less 4 times section 6A. So that's 4 times whatever your section 6A amount is over there. So even if you made a mistake when calculating that, as long as you then use the correct amount, the same one that you used, it's fine. Okay, so now I want you to see 24 minus 38,400 gives me a negative amount. And it can't be a negative amount. Right, so we just make this null. Then we say plus other qualifying medical expenses. Write it out in the exam, guys, whatever they tell you. It's 100,000 rands. So now add up my 0 over there. If that was an amount, it will obviously be an amount. Plus my 100,000 gives me 100,000. From that, I must deduct less 7.5% of my taxable income, which is that 700,000 there. So 700,000 times 7.5% is 52,500 rands. So you can see, guys, as they have a lot of medical expenses that qualify for that. That's 47,500. You multiply that by 25%, and that gives you 11,875 as your section 6B. So, as you can see here, guys, it's all about just memorizing these sections. You can also work through them in the Act, how they're written there. This is, make sure that when you're studying it in the Act, you look towards these formulas here, because this is exactly what the Act says. This is just a much simpler layout of seeing it.